Hi, I'm Shannon Van Sant. I'm the business editor for SupChina. And today we're focused on supply chains. Will the coronavirus pandemic prove to be a death knell for globalized supply chains? The US-China trade war had already weakened these chains, and now lockdown measures across the world have further disrupted production and transportation networks. Joining me this morning to talk about all of this is Dan Wang, a technology analyst at GovCal Dragonomics and a contributor to Bloomberg. He focuses on China's industrial capabilities and US technology controls. Also here is Zach Karabell, an author, columnist, and investor. He hosts the podcast What Could Go Right and analyzes economic and political trends as president of River Twice Research. And also here from Brazil is Flavio Barreiros. He is head of digital supply chain and operations for EY Latin America South. He is based in Sao Paulo and has led several large transformations in complex supply chains. He supports and advises global companies rethinking their supply chains to Latin America. And as Jesse, my colleague, introduced, we're taking questions from viewers, so please send in all your questions. We're eager to answer them. Zach, let me start with you. What is happening right now with supply chains around the world as COVID-19 sweeps across the globe?
So it's an interesting, I think, disjuncture between what people say is going on and what is going on. So there's, as you just alluded to in your intro remarks, there's a lot of talk about the rupture of supply chains, and that now is going to be, the break that has been fulminating of decoupling from China when it's the United States and Europe and Asia and its production lines running through China, reshoring, countries saying, never again will we allow our medical supplies to be vulnerable to foreign influence. And well, the French are saying this, the United States, every country is sort of saying we're going to make our own equipment. But part of the challenge is, one, we have the supply chains we have, and in a moment of crisis, there's not a lot of spare cash to just snap your fingers and rebuild trillions of dollars of global supply chains. And weirdly enough, this may prove to be a tiny saving grace of an absolute crisis, because China shut down in January and February, and its production halted while Western Europe and the United States in particular were still consuming. They were able to work off inventories of stuff that had been made in 2019. Then China begins to reopen in March just as those inventories are getting depleted, and then Western Europe and then the United States shut down, and then China starts producing. And now slowly China, Western Europe and the United States are opening up. So you may not have the same unbelievably untenable bottleneck of no supply and too much demand, right? Which is what would have happened if the West didn't shut down and China had stayed shut down. Or on the flip side, you're not going to have oversupply and no demand, which is kind of what would have happened if China had ramped up and then built up all these inventories, and then the United States and Europe stayed shut. None of this is going to look good, by the way. I'm not trying to, put lipstick on a pig. I'm just saying you have this odd dynamic going on, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more and we can go on to the others. But I think it's really important to recognize that no matter what the desire is of countries, companies, nations, governments to have everything become domestic and to uncouple and rejigger global supply chains, for the foreseeable future, we have the global supply chains we have, and they're the ones that are going to make stuff that helps rejigger or sustain every economy in the world for the next 12 months, 18 months, 2 years.
And the next few months obviously will be different than the next few years, but spark transformational change. One thing you and I had spoken about is the parallels between some of the challenges right now in the pharmaceutical industry and other sectors. Can you speak to that a little bit in terms of there's a great risk right now, or some perceive it as a risk, that the majority of drug manufacturing, of American drug manufacturing, is in China. Can you speak a little bit about the concerns over pharmaceutical manufacturing and what parallels this may have for other industries as well?
Yeah, so I mean, it's certainly true that between certain drugs and a lot of medical equipment, a significant portion of production, or certainly of some components, if not all the finished products for the medical equipment, occurs in China. I mean, some occurs here and some occurs in Germany, but a lot occurs in China. And uh, the perception of medical equipment and medical supply vulnerability is simply a microcosm of every high-tech component in the world. Semiconductor chips, obviously everyone knows about iPhones being assembled, a lot of um, apparel, although that's much more global now between the Philippines and Turkey and elsewhere. But a lot of high-tech components either have partial or final assembly in China. And again, the recognition of that in a time of crisis is applying to medical supplies, drugs, and equipment. But it's certainly true in every high-tech sense. And the Trump administration and certainly some Europeans have been aware that when it comes to 5G rollout and equipment, the whole imbroglio over Huawei and its 5G equipment spoke to countries perceiving that they had a vulnerability of too much of the production resided in any one country, and China in particular. So the healthcare thing is just this is what we're most acutely attuned to in a pandemic. It's not as if there's something unusual relative to high tech and certain appliances about that concentration lying in China. And again, yeah, you can make PPE, you can make equipment and masks much more easily, right? That's not a high tech, high touch assembly. So you can do that. Brazil could do that. The United States can do that. France can do that. Everybody can do a little bit of that. But you can't so easily do semiconductors, and you can't so easily do a lot of the high touch components of medical equipment. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of basic manufacturing that might shift for time being to respective countries so they can feel secure about gear. But there's not going to be a lot of sudden shift of high end stuff, because that takes years and literally hundreds of billions of dollars of investment to rejigger.
Dan, let me move to you. Your focus is technology and you're based in China. What are you seeing happening in China right now from your perch in terms of these supply chains?
Thanks very much, Shannon. So sitting here in Beijing, I think the data from both the high frequency indicators as well as the company guidance is fairly consistent, which is pointing to a steady, although still a little bit slow, of a resumption in production. So all of what we are able to see in terms of traffic data, in terms of deliveries, in terms of the air pollution, a lot of that is getting back to normal. And when companies guide through a lot of these things, they are also saying that many things are back to normal. And I think the issue now with the work resumption in China is that the supply chain in East Asia now is in pretty good shape relative to the rest of the world. So, a lot of the East Asian countries have apparently done a pretty good job in containing the virus. And given that most of the electronic supply chain is centered in East Asia, a lot of the work resumption has resumed. I think the problem now, though, is very much one of demand, not so much the physical act of putting the things together. So given that the virus has ravaged a lot of consumers around the world, if we are seeing very high unemployment rates in most of the world, I think people are, the electronics companies are a little bit nervous about whether a consumer will shell out quite a lot of money, especially for a relatively expensive phone that might be 5G enabled at the end of the year. And so right now, the FT reported 2 weeks ago that Foxconn and Pegatron, which are the two largest assemblers for the iPhone, right before the start of the ramp-up season, have actually been furloughing staff because they're just not quite certain that the demand is there. I should also point out that when it comes to something like the electronic supply chain, that although most things are getting back to normal, Apple needs to send quite a lot of staff over to the factories in China to actually be able to monitor production and make sure that everything is good quality. And given that China has more or less banned all foreigners from entering the country, there's a lot more difficulty with getting that all in shape. But I would still say that work resumption in China has been pretty good. The question is now mostly a demand issue of whether consumers will actually pay.
And Flavio, in Brazil, what impact has this whole coronavirus pandemic, what has it had on supply chains as it relates to Latin America?
Okay, Shan, thanks for the opportunity to share ideas here. Congratulate you for the event. Now we are still going to the top of this pandemic. We are experiencing a very big reduction in the demand side. So this is provoking an imbalancing in inventories, an imbalancing in production, and all the flows in the supply chain, and also pressuring companies very much in the cash flow. Companies are still keeping jobs here, but we don't know until when. So we are discussing right now how can we restart some especially the retails are closed and the stores, and we are discussing that in the supply side. So moving to the supply side, there is shortage, especially from components and high-tech products from Asia, for example. But this is lower, much lower because of the demand reduction. So the demand compensates this shortage. And I would say that also there is a big impact in the costs here. The costs are much higher than they were, especially because of the operation is running with alternatives, with workarounds. So you have to produce whatever you can with the inventory, have the inventory higher, so you are running in a safe mode. So this is also pressuring companies right now. There is a special care with tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, small suppliers that produce key components that can go bankrupt. So this is also really important. If we talk about specific sectors, I would say that the food sector and also the home care sectors are experiencing increasing their demand, especially for high volume items. So this is a thing, but a big reduction in automotive, textile, fashion apparel. So this is also an impact. If we think about the health and sector, we are experiencing. I'm personally leading with my team humanitarian control tower here in order to help public hospitals to a pro bono project of UI to help hospitals to find donators to provide. There are a lot of companies that are donating some products, equipments, and they can't match, they can't source products, specific equipments, alcohol gel, and respirators. So we are connecting this supply chain. So in this supply chain, the situation is very complicated. So there is lack of those equipments, those alcohol and so on. So the point we are discussing here is how can we produce things here, and most of the things can be produced here, as Zach said. So other companies like the textile companies, chemical companies are producing this. The most critical item here is as globally is the respirator.
All right, I have a couple of questions here from the audience. And Zach, I'll start with you. This audience member says, she basically asks, how difficult would it be for companies to relocate their operations outside of China and to afford redundancy? And how will this impact the competitiveness of companies and their economic efficiency for such relocation? You've spoken about this a little bit in some of your articles and op-eds about the US and China being almost like a couple on the verge of a divorce.
Yeah, I mean, so, there's a non-funny joke going around about the couple who was fully prepared to get divorced sometime in mid-February, and then, the virus struck and they're left with an apartment they can't sell and a marriage they can't terminate, living under the same roof. And I think in a lot of ways, what's going on between the United States and China is like that now. I just want to get a figure correct, so I'm looking down. So just to give an example, a few weeks ago, the Japanese government rolled out a $2 billion fund to subsidize Japanese companies moving production back to Japan. And in the United States, Larry Kudlow and others have talked about creating some sort of favorable write-off, depreciation, whatever it would be that would allow US companies to do the same in the United States. But to give a sense of what would be required, in the fall, Foxconn tried to sell one of their display panel factories, not the main iPhone, obviously, but they built a factory in Guangzhou, and they wanted to sell it, and the price was $8.8 billion for that one factory, and they didn't find a buyer at that time. There's another iPhone factory in Zhengzhou that cost about $8 or $9 billion all told to build, but was also facilitated by a $10 billion infrastructure plan by the local municipal government to upgrade the airport, the roads, the transportation. So that's two factories, right? Out of thousands or several hundred really large ones. And then you have a $2 billion fund from the Japanese government to relocate manufacturing. And you recognize just how paltry $2 billion is relative to how much it would actually cost to do all these things. And that's where, my view, and everybody's got an opinion, and crystal balls are in huge demand these days and in short supply, but where's the money going to come from to actually do that, right? So you can talk all you want about now's the time and it's over and we're going to suddenly start making iPhones in Arizona or Mexico for that matter. But we are not in a cash-rich environment, a lot of liquidity in the financial system. And I just think people need to think about, it's very easy for pundits and politicians to claim that now is the time. But there is a really cold reality of where is the money going to come from? And what I gave are just two tiny illustrations. It's not just about building a new factory. Those factories have to have roads, and they have to have transportation networks, and they have to be able to link up to other component factories. And those component factories have to be able to talk to each other in real time in order for them to assemble. And Dan knows this stuff better than anyone, right? In terms of just, there's a really intricate network that's been built. You cannot just snap your fingers, particularly in the middle of a crisis where the main focus is going to be public health, and rejigger those. You're on mute, Shannon.
Mute.
Thank you. Sorry. Dan, what have you seen regarding that? A lot of companies have chosen to base their operations in China. Why have they? And what have you seen in terms of the challenges for companies trying to move to, say to Vietnam or India or other places?
I think there's three reasons for firms to actually do so. I think there has been this longer-term structural issue of Chinese wages rising fairly steadily over the last, basically 2 decades. There was this more shorter impetus of the trade war that has pushed some firms to want to relocate production out of China. And then there is now this COVID issue. Now, I think what strikes me is that looking at the investment figures and then looking at China's exports, how little things have actually moved given the structural wage rises as well as the trade war. So the figures from Rhodium Group show that US FDI in China last year is about the same as it is every year. It's at around $9 billion. And so in fact, it actually slightly rose in 2019 from 2018. And if you take a look at something like China's exports of light industry goods, so these are things like furniture, apparel, a lot of consumer goods, which are relatively labor intensive and not so R&D intensive. China's exports of light industry goods actually has not fallen over the last 3 or 4 years. So even if when you expect light industry goods to be moving to other places, we're not seeing so much of that. Now, when I go over to Taipei and talk to companies like the contract manufacturers that are quite big, what they universally tell me is that China is still the best place to manufacture in the world. Basically, this is the place where, as Zach says, there are the component clusters. There's excellent infrastructure here. It has very credible policy support, and it's just generally the best trained workers. And a lot of the contract manufacturers in places like Taiwan are saying, why should we spend billions of dollars replicating our supply chain, not so much improving it, but simply replicating it in other places. One of them told me that the workers in Indonesia that we have are half as expensive as our Chinese workers, but also they're half as efficient. So why should we spend all of this capital trying to recreate something that exists quite well? And so the challenges are, I think, to replicate a lot of that, but I think much of that can be replicated even throughout to something like 2005 or so, mid-2000s. Guangdong, which is one of China's manufacturing powerhouses, had these rolling blackouts that they figured out actually fairly only, relatively recently. The Chinese response to COVID, I think, has been pretty credible from the corporate perspective. A lot of the companies, I think, have been saying, well, we're not very sure that other countries can handle this quite as well as China has. But I think that other countries will at least get quite a lot better in the infrastructure in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, Latin America, many other places.
Mm-hmm. And I have another question here from an audience member. He says, after the pandemic, will there be significant structural changes to supply chains, such as delinearization due to 5G and IoT technologies? Dan, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I'll give it a quick try. Basically, when I speak to the contract manufacturers in Taiwan, they tell me that very little of the process can actually be automated. When we're taking a look at the stamping, the PCB motherboard, the assembly process, and the packaging, it is still extremely difficult to automate. And so long as you can't automate a broad swath of a lot of these things, when you need trained, skilled workers actually doing the assembly here, I think it is pretty difficult to move very much.
Okay. Flavio, I'd like to ask you a follow-up question here. What do you expect? What kind of changes, as we talk about how these supply chains are changing or not changing quickly in the world now, what kind of change do you expect in South America in terms of its industrial footprint? And do you foresee a shift in production to South America over the next few months and then in the medium to long term? And how does that vary across sectors?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Great question. Well, I don't see a massive change because there is also a question here that question capabilities. As Zach said, also there are some high-end products that you have to come up with a lot of investments to face those and to produce that products. But I see an important word here that is vulnerability. And this vulnerability is critical for the companies in the supply chain of the future. So I see, especially for mainstream products, I see a change. Yes, I see a change. If we think about the economies in South America and also in Latin America, Mexico and Brazil have a depreciation of their currency by more than 30%. Chile and Argentina had a depreciation around 10%. So there is also an affordability. The importing products became very expensive for Brazil and Mexico, for example. Many sectors here, I would say the automotive sector, the electronic sector, are discussing how to produce components here. I would say components here, and especially finished goods. I would go through health sector, life science and chemical is very important. The supply chain is based on Asia. Perhaps there might be some formulation here. I wouldn't say the R&D would be transferred, but I would say the formulation. It's also there might be some governmental incentives there because of the layoffs and so on. This can create also a labor affordability. I would also say that Latin America may be an alternative, but not. I don't see as the main supplier, but maybe an alternative for resilience and for supply chains globally. So because of all those points that I mentioned, perhaps there might be an important change in the exporting flow for those countries here. And I would say that especially for some sectors that the competitiveness increased. I would say that the products are going to be cheaper. Also, the products that are had a great value, like agribusiness sector, iron ore, and others. So I see this. I see a change based on these facts, not a massive change.
Okay. I have another question here, Dan. You might want to take a shot at this. He says, there have been reports that India is offering favorable, lucrative contracts to companies that are looking to relocate from China. Do you think there will be institutional roadblocks or fiscal penalties from Beijing for doing so? And do you think companies will have autonomy in deciding whether or not to relocate factories and warehouses?
A little bit of a tough question on what Beijing is likely to do. I'm not aware, maybe others are, of very stiff penalties or sanctions that Beijing has levied on firms for scaling up production elsewhere. I think it is plausible that that the government might, impose some hassles on that. But I think that if a company, even a firm as large as Apple has said, we are planning to scale up production in India. And so, I'm not aware that Beijing has been able to veto those types of decisions.
I have a couple of questions coming in here about rare earths and minerals and the security risk for the supply chain involving sensitive technology and particularly rare earths. Is that something, Dan or Zach, you would like to? Zach, would you like to tackle that?
So when I think at some point 8 or 9 years ago, it might have been around 2010, like the Western world woke up to the fact that most of the rare earths that go into cellular and other technology are produced in China, and there was this flurry of the United States was going to open mines. There was a rare earth mine that was going to be opened in the southwest of the United States, and everybody started, thinking that this was going to be the poison pill that Beijing could utilize in an economic conflict that could cut off access to rare earths, which would then cripple various high-end electrical components production. One of the reasons that didn't happen, and I would say almost certainly won't happen, is cutting off access to an absolutely vital component. One is a total two-edged sword, right? It's not like Beijing or China has its own independent high-end electronic supply chain. They're trying to build one, right, with their own domestic 5G that is potentially separate from a global supply chain of high-end. And so there could be a point, I imagine, in 10 years where you literally would have two distinct supply chains, one for domestic Chinese consumption and one for exports, where China could, in theory, cut off access. But they can't cut off access to rare earths to the world without doing immense damage to themselves. Plus, as we know from every moment in history where powers that controlled oil tried to embargo oil, whether it was the United States vis-a-vis Japan in 1940, whether it was OPEC in the 1970s, you can't do that without intense, immense, and powerful domestic consequences, right? This is not a weapon that you can utilize without causing yourself great pain. So it's not quite a nuclear weapon, but it's the kind of thing you don't just do. And so the fear of it is overblown relative to the cost of using it. And that's just I don't know if Dan has a different view about that, but I think it's not a concern that should rise to the level like of a first order concern.
Dan, what do you think about that?
Rare earths are not super rare, so I think it takes a couple of years to build some of that capability up. China has in fact restricted some of those exports to Japan in 2012 when there was a dispute over islands. But I think there is quite a lot of production scaling up in Australia right now.
Okay. Dan, I have another question for you from somebody in the audience. How do you think the BRI, the Belt and Road investments, how will they be impacted by these changes to the supply chain? Is that something people are talking about?
Not something I have great expertise in. I think the Belt and Road is going to have less generous funding because, as Zach said, there's a lot less cash to go around.
Okay. And
just one thing on that. I mean, Beijing will be able to come up with some of the money, whether it's to continue building freshwater ports in Pakistan or certain types of investment. Already, there's been a halt of some of these projects. So it's clear that the really ambitious Belt and Road 2025, that China is going to build this or fund or underwrite this massive infrastructure, that may slow down. But as we've seen from kind of sovereign creation of money in a time of crisis, if this follows an absolute perceived like geopolitical need for China, which it does, I'm sure much of it will continue just with a 2020 hiccup.
Flavio, I'm going to ask each of you about this, but Flavio, I want to start with you. That's another question from the audience, and they want to know which countries stand out as good candidates for supply chain diversification. And so what are you seeing in Latin America and across sectors, various locations and countries in terms of supply chain diversification? Which places stand out?
Yeah, I see Mexico as a country, Brazil, and Argentina is a country as well. Chile, perhaps also. There are productions in Paraguay, for some operation. I see, depending on the Mexico is really close to US and can handle the lead time and be a quick supply alternative for them. And I see the South America, especially with the commodities and so on, and perhaps may have some alternative for mainstream products also, especially with this currency changes, because it becomes very cheap. And also I see because of the labor cost reduction, and there are some reforms that are happening here to increase competitiveness.
Okay. And Dan, what about in Asia? What are the top candidates in Asia that are people are looking at in terms of diversifying their supply chains?
Vietnam is the most popular, definitely, and I think the other chatter is around Indonesia, Malaysia, and India. I think is not quite there yet, but India will be in the next couple of years, given its large population size, which means it has both a lot of workers as well as a very large market.
Okay.
Also on this, Shannon, I mean, a lot of this is additive, not subtractive, meaning it's not like there's a zero-sum world of production. And particularly as, at least pre-COVID, more and more people were consuming more and more stuff or needing more and more stuff. People have this tendency to talk about supply chains that go through China as they're going to be relocated, as if there's one static supply chain that currently can serve the world. What you actually have is additive supply chains, right? It's not like every gain for Vietnam has been a loss for China, or every gain for Mexico has been a loss for China. There is, in fact, multiple nodes that are evolving, as well as China evolving. And as Dan said, look, there's been remarkably little fall off in overall both Chinese production, exports, let alone the fact that a lot of China's supply chain is to feed into 1.4 billion people or whatever the number is within China itself. So, again, it's not as if there is this thing called a supply chain. I mean, I know most of the audience know this, but I'm just reiterating it. And then it either goes to Vietnam or it goes to China. There's a lot of production. And I don't think, pandemic land is going to change the fact that no matter how much of a world crisis this is for the next 12 or 18 months or whatever, whatever the number is, there's still going to be 8+ billion people on the planet, many of whom are going to be aspiring to a better life, disease or no disease. And that's going to demand places where stuff gets made, and it will be made in different places. And as Flavia said, there'll be more production within Latin America for Latin America. And that's all for the best, right? This, again, it's not a zero sum. That doesn't mean that's like a negative for China any more than it should have meant that it's a negative for the United States, that there's multiple nodes of production.
Okay, so Zach, there's another question here from the audience that would be good for you to answer. How will China's own dependence on its factories for foreign exchange and U.S. ability to depend on Chinese supply chains, how would this, impact China's own dependence on its factories for foreign exchange and the U.S. ability to depend on Chinese supply chains for final assembly? Does China still need the rest of the world to the same extent as it has in the past?
I think every country, particularly large, powerful countries, would prefer a universe where it depends on nobody for anything. But that doesn't exist. So, the United States would love it if it could do whatever it wants and, the hell with everybody else. And China is very much like the United States in that desire to be kind of inoculated, a word that's become ever more potent in our present moment, from foreign influence. But that desire and the real world are way apart, right? So I have no doubt that there are multiple nodes within these countries that would prefer it as if we could just make everything for ourselves and not import anything from anyone and only export so that other people would give us their money and we wouldn't. I mean, it just, like, that's a world that's notionally a fantasy that is very appealing, particularly to sovereigns that want control. But I just don't believe that world, while it's a pull, is one that we're likely to create anytime soon, no matter how much desire there may be under certain circles. And again, part of it, as I've said, and we'll keep saying, is like, where's the money? I suppose you could have an industrial US policy in a fantasy land that says we're going to cut off all trade with China and spend $3 trillion building those supply chains in the next years. And, I suppose that policy is theoretically possible and would at least be coherent, but it's not been part of actual US policy. It's been more like, wouldn't it be nice if? And so I guess that, and the foreign exchange and the dollar issue, China would like to have less money in the United States, but it's been a good place to put money, and they've been willing to invest in the United States. I'm sure that will decrease because the United States is simply a more hostile place for Chinese investment, but it will decrease over time, not over the next months.
Sure. Dan, there's a follow-up to the question on India. How attractive do you think production in India is? And are the incentives in India attractive enough to compensate for cost and other operational issues? Is this something you can answer?
When I chat with companies, they say that India is still quite a bit away from being very good for production. So there are these issues with acquiring land in India, the issues with some of the workers not always willing to travel as far as Chinese have been willing. There are definitely a lot of issues with infrastructure. There are issues with people of different religious groups living together in one set of dormitories. And then, a government that isn't quite so credible in providing policy support. And so I think there are still, these are the common issues that people bring up, that at the price point, India, from most what I hear, is not quite as attractive as a place to be.
Okay. And I have another question for you, Dan. This person says, changing dynamics with Hong Kong has companies like mine concerned about the ability for low overhead trade in and out of China. Are there any thoughts about how these dynamics may shift as time passes? Is that something you've looked at?
Well, I'm not really sure what low overhead trade is, but yes, certainly it does seem like there is a bit of a movement to emphasize one country over two systems. And US legislation has wound through in Congress to make that also part of reality.
Okay. We've got a bunch of questions coming in. This person asks again, where is the money going to come from? And he wants to know, Zach, maybe you can take a look at this. In the case, one is either going to spend money on social services and a social safety net for those unemployed due to manufacturing shifting to China and Asia, or is that going to involve some sort of subsidy to bring some of those jobs back to the US? So how will this impact the social safety net?
So I think one of the misunderstandings of manufacturing is that for the most part, U.S. manufacturing's output as a percentage of GDP has remained quite high. It's actually not declined measurably over the past 20 years. Manufacturing employment has declined measurably because of robotics, automation, efficiencies, just-in-time manufacturing. So the idea that if you bring manufacturing back, you also bring back a huge number of jobs, unless the manufacturing you're bringing back is very low-end manufacturing that is high labor touch. And even that high labor touch in multiple countries is becoming less people intensive as automation goes ever more deep within manufacturing. So, there's the joke going around a few years ago was you used to build a plant, right? You built a plant in the United States and it was 4,000 people and multiple shifts. And that then led to a whole ecosystem within the town. And then, now you open a plant and it's 400 people and automation, and it leads to some jobs, but most of those are high end and they're not working class, and you need a college degree and you need some knowledge of software and how to reprogram. And 15 years from now, a plant will open and it will have one job, a security guard and a dog. And the security guard will be there to make sure that no one breaks in and the robots are working, and the dog will be there to make sure the security guard doesn't fall asleep. So, basically you have a world where reshoring manufacturing is no longer what it was. It's not a guarantee of jobs, and the jobs are not likely to be quote unquote working class, only high school education jobs. Again, unless you bring back lots of t-shirt factories, but the wage level of that relative to the cost of that at Walmart or something just don't add up. So, it's possible you could create several 100,000 more manufacturing jobs with an aggressive reshoring policy in the United States, or the same in Japan. Maybe you could create 1 million jobs. I mean, I don't know what the number is, but relative to a workforce of 140 million in the United States, that's simply not appreciable relative to the cost that would be required, nor do I think it's going to happen.
Yeah. May I just make a comment here? There is an important thing that we've been experienced for the last few years, which is the digital revolution and the automation of lights out operation. This also can increase very much productivity, and can also enable products customization and so on. So this can also allow production be transferred to close to the point of sales. This is an important thing that we have to consider.
Yeah, and one more thing on that. I mean, for instance, New York recently, it's going to try to manufacture its own swabs for testing for COVID, and the plastic thing that you need for the swabs, much of which was actually being made in northern Italy, not a great time for that, is now going to be made, I don't know in what bulk, but enough, by 3D printing companies in Brooklyn. And 3D printing has always been like the next, when's it going to happen? One of the propellants of the current crisis could be much more, as Flavia said, localized production of things that can be 3D printed. People have been talking about this as the next wave of manufacturing anyway. But again, this isn't really a job creator. It's a productivity enhancer. It changes the nature of supply chains, but it doesn't create appreciably large number of jobs any more than any high-tech technology-enabled industry does. These are high employment, high skill, few numbers, high output.
Okay, Dan, I've got a question here about quality control. Maybe you can take this one. Quality control has proven to be a weak area for Chinese-made products in some sectors, this person writes. Do you think there will be major changes in China or more government oversight to address this issue?
My sense is that quality control has used to be a big issue, but Chinese manufacturing now is pretty good and able to deal with a lot of these things. 10 years ago when Made in China mostly referenced cheap apparel and toys, I think that's generally not the case anymore. And certainly also the government has had a role to play in actually making that happen.
And there's a question here as well about the Philippines as a possible manufacturing point. Have you looked at that, and what kinds of companies might be looking at the Philippines as a possible place? Or he says, thoughts on the Philippines as a manufacturing point for auto parts that will end up being shipped to both the USA and China. It's a highly specific question, but perhaps you can take it.
Yeah, so Philippines, Indonesia, that is also Malaysia are also often frequently brought up. Yes.
Okay. I have a question here from a man named Robert Newman. Do you have, this is again a very specific question. I'm not sure if anybody can take this. Do you have any thoughts on implications of a bill in Congress shifting farmer production from China? Zach, is that something you'd like to?
Yeah, I mean, I've been following. I mean, all these bills are very similar. They try to offer tax incentives, maybe some accelerated depreciation, some subsidies within current codes. And again, they're part of this understandable desire, and I'm sure it will shift some production back, but it's simply not enough money. I mean, no matter how you, and these are easy bills to pass, right? It's a way people can come back to their constituents and say, look, we're doing something to change the dynamic here to make you more secure. But that doesn't mean that you can't really mandate these things. You could if you were going to spend trillions of dollars, right? I mean, if this was a full-throated industrial policy, right? We are going to, as Dan said, these are, you can rebuild these supply chains, which is what Taiwan has experienced, but it would require massive effort, huge expenditures, and a lot of time. And the question isn't whether it could be done, because of course it can be done. It's whether or not any country is either able or willing in the current climate to do so with all the attendant costs and frictions that would create. And you are, as we've already seen, seeing incremental globalization of what had been China-centric, which is happening regardless of pandemic land, and maybe accelerated somewhat because of it. But a bill in Congress to do this it's a drop in the proverbial bucket.
Sure. Okay, Dan, I've got one up here for you. Hold on, let me find it. Sorry. Well, there's one question here. I'm having trouble finding it. And perhaps both Zach and Dan, you can take this. It's from Benjamin Hopwood. Considering the demand shock that is emerging worldwide, will Chinese industry have access to sufficient funding to bridge this economic low period? And how long before significant bankruptcies among medium-sized companies become apparent? And how will this impact the supply chain as demand resumes in the future?
So this is something that we are tracking fairly closely. It's certainly a great concern for the Chinese government, which has tried to roll out a series of programs exactly to make sure that this sort of thing doesn't happen. But we know now that unemployment in China is rising, that there are a lot of firms that are able to get production going because they figured out both the type of production that they need as well as the logistics to work all these things out, but there are no customers on the other end. But I think there should be enough programs in China to make sure that these productive facilities are able to keep producing when demand gets back to normal. I think it's unlikely that there would be just mass failure for all of these issues, but I don't know if Zach has a view.
You know, I think what's interesting is that the areas of the Western economies that are most dramatically affected are not the areas of those economies that need the stuff that China or other countries make. Meaning it's the service industry, the high touch, the cruises, the restaurants, hotels, conventions, sporting, you know, stuff that is people intensive, not high tech. Now, you're right that if tens of millions of people don't have jobs, they're not going to buy the equipment and services that are provided, that are exported. But there's not this, I don't think you're going to have the same demand destruction based on that unemployment that you are going to have of destruction of industries that are largely service, human to human service oriented, not software service oriented. So I don't think you're going to have the level of demand destruction of stuff that's made that, for instance, China exports relative to these other industries that aren't really part of that supply chain to begin with. But we'll obviously have to see.
Okay. All right. Let's see here. And some of these are repeated questions of what you said earlier, but in terms of, as we're wrapping up here, what do you suggest, Zach? You had an interesting piece that came out today. What are the lessons learned from what we're going through now? And what do you think leaders in China, the US, and other places, how should supply chains change in the future?
So look, we are in a high moment of, it's easy to forecast the end of things as we know it. And it may indeed be the end of things as we know it. I'm just saying that feels like the more credible forecast in a time where everything has been upended. And first, I think it's really important for all of us to step back and recognize that we don't know. And this is a moment in time where a wise statement is, I don't know, not a statement of ignorance. Second, if it's so easy to forecast the end of things as we know it, but at other moments of human rupture, things haven't changed as dramatically as we thought, it's worth entertaining the fact that things might not be as different as we think at some point in the next year plus. And then in terms of how we should think about manufacturing, this push and pull between like, I want to control everything, therefore I don't want to be dependent on another country making stuff that I need, is going to exert a powerful pull. But so is, I want to make stuff that we need in the most frictionless, inexpensive way as possible. And that contest between those two things is going to continue. It may tilt more in the next couple of years to, I want to make my own stuff so I'm not dependent on other people. Again, where's the money? But some of that was going to change anyway, as Flavio pointed out, in that the nature of technology and just-in-time and 3D printing and robotics was leading to a possible future in the next 10 years of much more localized, nimble production of stuff that used to be needed to be made in bulk elsewhere. That is a pull that's happening anyway. This may accelerate that, but it won't have been caused by pandemic land. I know that's not a simple binary answer, but at least it covers some of the bases.
That's great. Okay. We're almost at the end time. Thank you so much for your participation. And thank you, viewers, for sending in so many questions. I'm sorry there are a bunch we weren't able to get to, so I apologize for that. But I hope this has been an informative session. And thanks again.
Thank you for moderating, Shannon. And thanks, Dan and Flavio.
Thank you very much.